Michael Rain's hand hovered over the lever, his fingers trembling as he stared at the glowing red warning lights on the engineering console. The station was burning. Deck 7 was already lost, and the fire was spreading like a hungry beast, gnawing its way through the dark corridors of Selena 9. His breath was shallow, the pressure in his chest mounting with each second that ticked by. A voice crackled through his calm. "Michael, do it now." Commander Voss's voice was sharp, frantic. Behind him, the comm system screamed warnings, oxygen levels plummeting, fire-suppressing systems failing. But Michael couldn't shake the thought that he was sealing the fate of 17 people he knew, people who had worked beside him. They were out of his reach now, trapped in a section of the station that couldn't be accessed without triggering a larger disaster. He gritted his teeth, eyes flicking between the countdown and the venting pressure systems. The flames were consuming the station faster than he had anticipated. If he didn't act, Selena 9 could be lost, not just Deck 7, but the entire station. The fire would spread to the core systems, the life support failing. It would mean the death of hundreds of people. But the 17 trapped in the lower section, he knew their names. He'd worked beside them just hours ago. They were more than just faces. They were the station's heartbeat, just like him, just like everyone else. But he had no choice. The lever had to be pulled. Michael's hand slammed down onto the lever. The hydraulics hissed in protest, and the bulkhead door slid shut with a sound like cracking teeth, sealing away the section that was now burning to its core. For a moment, everything was still. The alarms stopped. The fire's roar was muffled. The station groaned in relief, but the weight of his decision hung heavy in the air. The console blinked green. The pressure stabilized. But Michael didn't feel relief. He didn't feel anything but the pounding in his chest. He stood there, still clutching the lever, staring at the polished steel of the door that separated him from the 17 people who wouldn't make it out alive. For a moment, the air smelled of smoke and burning metal, and then the silence was broken by the pounding. Fists striking metal, voices muffled but desperate. Michael's heart stuttered. He could hear them, the workers on the other side of the door, the sound of their struggle, the sound of their fate. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He stared at the door, his reflection distorted by the thin layer of smoke drifting through the ventilation grates. He'd just sealed their fate. He'd saved the station. He'd saved the 400 other people on board, but at what cost? The arrival of the envoy. 6 hours later, Michael stood on the observation deck, his bruised face stinging in the cool breeze as he watched Selena 9 float in the dark void of space. The station's hull was scarred, emergency lights flashing sporadically across its broken exterior. The fire damage was extensive. It was a miracle it hadn't spread farther. Commander Voss was beside him, his posture rigid. "You saved 400 lives today," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Michael said nothing. He wasn't sure what to say. The quiet was suddenly shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from behind. Michael turned to see the envoy, a woman draped in dark fabric that seemed to absorb the light around her. Her face was hidden by a veil, but her posture was regal. She moved with an authority that commanded the space around her, despite the informal setting. "The Queen's envoy would like to thank you personally," Voss said, his voice barely audible. "This station survives because of difficult choices." He gestured to the woman behind him. She stepped forward, and Michael could sense the weight of her presence even before she spoke. Her voice was smooth, almost kind, but there was a coldness to it. "The station survives because of difficult choices," she repeated, "and you have made the right one." A chill crept down Michael's spine as she gestured toward 2 guards who dragged a figure forward. The person was hooded and stumbling, their hands bound by shackles. The guards threw the figure at Michael's feet, and she collapsed in a heap, gasping for air. "The Queen's failed daughter," the envoy said, her voice laced with disdain. "Tainted blood, fourth in a line that should have ended at 3. We were bringing her to the disposal sector when the fire started. You've earned your payment." Michael stood frozen, unable to comprehend the situation. This was the price for saving the station? A person, a woman, offered to him as payment, her life worth nothing but a cruel transaction. She was nothing more than a thing, a broken object to be disposed of. Michael didn't want to touch her, didn't want to accept this payment, but the command was clear. He knelt down, instinctively reaching out to help her, though his hands felt foreign on her fragile form. As he touched her arm, she jerked away, her eyes flashing with terror and rage. "No," she hissed, her voice rough. "Don't touch me." Her body was trembling, and the scent of her fear was overpowering. Michael tried again, this time gentler, but she lashed out with an almost inhuman speed, striking him across the jaw with her shackled hands. The blow was sharp, brutal. Michael staggered back, blood filling his mouth, his vision blurring as the pain shot through his skull. For a moment, everything was silent except for the pounding in his head. He looked up at her again. She was frozen mid-strike, her hands still raised, trembling. A drop of his blood had landed on her cheek. They both stared at it, and for the first time, the look in her eyes shifted. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something primal. Her hand trembled as she touched the blood on her face. "No, no," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You shouldn't have touched me." Michael stood slowly, wiping blood from his lips. "I was trying to help," he said, his voice hoarse, but she didn't respond. She just stared at him, eyes wide, horror radiating off her. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the world outside the station, the people around them, the flickering lights overhead. Nothing moved, not even the stars outside the observation window. Michael didn't know what to do. He'd made the choice. He'd sealed the door, and now he was bound to this strange, broken woman, bound by blood. The Derelict floated silently in the void, a forgotten relic drifting far from any safe haven. Its hull was encrusted with ice, the frozen armor of years spent in the cold. The once mighty ship, a proud symbol of advanced technology and exploration, now seemed like little more than a tomb, its pulse long silenced by the unforgiving cosmos. Miles Corbin, a salvage technician, wasn't in the habit of thinking about the past of the ships he picked apart. He was here for one reason: recovery. The cold didn't bother him, nor did the isolation. He'd been alone for longer than he cared to count, sifting through the wreckage of ships that had long lost their purpose. The only thing that mattered was what could be salvaged, what was still useful. The wreckage of the Derelict was no different, until his scanner beeped, a faint flicker among the cold, sterile readings. A life sign. Impossible. No one should be aboard a ship like this, especially after so much time in deep space. His hands gripped the controls of the salvage pod, but his mind raced. Company protocol demanded quarantine first, check for contamination, sweep for signs of an outbreak. But the scanner didn't lie. It showed life weak and fatting. There was someone or something alive in the wreckage. If he didn't act fast, it would be too late. The storm front rolling across this sector would bury the Derelict in ice dense enough to crush steel. And the last thing he wanted was to leave someone behind to die in this frozen grave. His hands moved with practiced speed, directing the pod closer to the wreck. The magnetic grapples extended like fingers, latching onto the icy surface of the ship. The pod shuddered as it locked into place. The ship was in terrible shape, its outer airlock sealed with thick layers of frost. Miles cycled through the ship's entry system, hoping the manual override would still work. But the frost had welded the mechanisms shut, and as his gloved hands twisted and pulled, the metal screamed in protest. He wedged a pry bar into the gap and threw his weight against it, the ice cracking like brittle bones. With a final push, the inner door gave way, sending a wave of cold rushing into the pod. The temperature inside the Derelict was unbearable. Miles' suit's thermal regulators whined as they struggled to compensate. -40 and dropping. His breath came out in sharp, ragged gasps, fogging up the inside of his helmet. The cold hit him like a fist, but he pressed on, pulling himself through the hatch and into the corridor. Everything was covered in ice. Not the clear, crystalline kind you read about in textbooks. The frost here was milky white, thick and glassy, flowing over walls, ceilings, and the floor in frozen waves. The emergency lighting flickered, casting a pale blue glow across the ship's desolate halls. The ship had been abandoned for decades, its power systems long dead, but somehow a faint hum still echoed through the walls. His scanner flickered again, pulsing with a weak but unmistakable signal. The life sign was ahead. The cold was suffocating, and his suit's heating unit struggled to maintain its temperature. Every step he took felt like it could be his last. As he moved deeper into the ship, the smell of mildew and decay filled the air. The once pristine hallways were now a tomb of ice. There was something almost deliberate in the frost patterns, a strange design that almost made it look like the ship was alive, alive in a way that no machine should be. He rounded a corner, his feet crunching on the ice, and came face to face with a horrific sight. A crew quarters door stood ajar, its metal frame warped by the pressure of the ice. Inside, two figures lay on the floor. One of them was clearly dead, frozen mid-crawl, a hand outstretched toward a sealed door. The ice had claimed him completely, encasing him in a translucent shell. Through the frost, Miles could make out his face, mouth open in a silent scream. The other shape stirred. It was a woman, young, maybe 20 standard years, curled up against the far wall with her knees drawn to her chest. Her skin had taken on a bluish tint and frost clung to her hair in delicate crystals. She wore thermal gear that was 3 sizes too large, patched with strips of insulation torn from the walls. Her hand was gripping a small utility cutter, its fuel cell dark and dead. Her eyes opened as he entered, and for a moment Miles froze. Her eyes were black, so dark that they swallowed the iris and they tracked his every movement. There was something in them, a ferocity that he couldn't quite place, like a predator watching him. "Eid," she whispered, her voice rough, barely audible. Miles paused, his heart racing. "Who?" "The Ice Weavers," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They come when they smell hunger." The words hit him like a physical blow. The scanner hadn't mentioned anyone else aboard. There had been no other heat signatures, no movement except the girl's shallow breathing. His mind raced as he swept the room with a quick glance, searching for the source of the threat. But there was nothing, no movement, just the girl and the frozen corpse at her feet. "Who are you?" Miles asked, his voice steady, but a hint of fear slipped into his tone. He was alone here, and if there were others, if the girl was hiding something. Her trembling hand lifted, pointing at the frozen body of the man. "The fallen feed the living," she muttered. "Law keeps us warm." Miles swallowed. The words felt wrong. The cold in the ship, the frost covering everything, it wasn't just a natural phenomenon. This ship, these people, they lived by rules he couldn't understand. And somehow this girl, this alien, had survived it all. His stomach twisted. The utility cutter in her hand, clean, sharp, was no tool for maintenance. It was a weapon, a tool meant to cut through flesh. Before he could say anything more, the ground trembled beneath him. Footsteps. Heavy. Not his own. They were coming, the Weavers were close. The ship shuddered again, the ice beneath Miles' boots creaking in protest. His eyes darted between the girl, Kaylin, he realized now, from the faint name tag partially obscured by frost, and the corridor ahead. The temperature in the ship was steadily plummeting, but it was the sound of those approaching footsteps, slow but deliberate, that froze his blood. "They're coming," Kaylin repeated, her voice flat as if she had said the same thing 1,000 times. "And they'll take everything from you." Miles felt a surge of urgency. The Derelict was a tomb, but in the icy silence it was also a trap. He could hear nothing else but the echo of his own breath fogging his helmet, the hiss of his suit's thermal systems fighting the cold. The Weavers, whoever they were close, and if they were anything like Kaylin had implied, they would not care about the survival of outsiders like him. "Who are they?" Miles asked, his words a low growl of disbelief. "What the hell is going on here?" Kaylin didn't answer right away. Her gaze never wavered from the door, her black eyes scanning the dark corridor beyond. She looked at him once, her face pale under the layer of frost, lips cracked and blue. "The Weavers were once like you, like us," she said, her voice carrying a quiet, dangerous truth. "They are what happens when the cold gets inside you. They survive, but at a cost. They take warmth from others, from anything they can get. They need it." A cold knot twisted in Miles' stomach. He had known desperation could drive people to extremes, but this was something different. He glanced at the dead body, the poor bastard frozen in the middle of a crawl. He had been caught in this law of survival, frozen by his failure to keep up. Miles shuddered and pulled his focus back to Kaylin. "Are they?" Miles couldn't finish the question. The idea was too grotesque, too foreign. Yet the terror in Kaylin's eyes confirmed his suspicions. The Weavers weren't just an alien faction, they were something worse. They had turned survival into a brutal law. "They were once my people," Kaylin said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "But they gave themselves to the cold. The law became everything." Miles moved toward her, his mind racing, trying to think through his options. The Weavers had been tracking her. They must have been the ones who had caused the wreckage on this ship. The cracks in the bulkhead, the broken corridors, the ship had been attacked. He looked over his shoulder at the ice-coated walls. There was no obvious escape, not unless they reached the bridge and managed to contact the outside world. But the Weavers would be on them long before that. Kaylin's voice broke through his thoughts. "You don't understand," she whispered, her eyes narrowing as she turned to face him. "You think you can escape them, but the cold will make you like them." "No," Miles said, shaking his head. "I won't let it." He gripped her arm, a fire kindling in his chest. "We're getting out of here, no more laws, no more ice." She stared at him for a long moment, her black eyes searching his face. Then she nodded, though the doubt still lingered in her expression. She was skeptical. She had survived this far by obeying the law. The law of survival, where taking warmth from others was the only way to stay alive. Suddenly, the ship's dim lighting flickered again, and the rumble grew louder. The weavers were moving faster. Kaylin turned and grabbed the utility cutter from the floor, holding it tightly in her hands. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, but the weapon seemed to give her a renewed sense of purpose. "We need to move," Miles said, his voice more urgent now. "Do you have any idea where the control room is?" She nodded slowly, eyes flicking over her shoulder as if afraid to see the shadows behind them. 3 levels up, past the mess hall, through the main corridor, but it's sealed. The weavers know every escape route. "Then we'll make one," Miles replied, a grim determination in his voice. He moved toward the corridor, pulling his suit's power pack tighter around his chest. His internal monitors flashed warnings. His suit's energy reserves were already at 75%, but he ignored them. There was no time to think about that. The cold slammed against him like a physical force as he stepped forward, the icy air seeping through every crack in his suit. He could feel his fingers numbing as the temperature plummeted further. "We'll need to get to the engineering deck," Kaylin said, her voice still low, like she was afraid someone might be listening. "If we can override the ship's systems, maybe we can send a distress signal before they find us." Miles nodded, although the idea of overriding an ancient ship's systems wasn't exactly reassuring. The Derelict had seen better days, but the only option they had now was to push forward, try to make it to the central control systems, and get some help. The footsteps behind them stopped. Miles froze in place, every muscle tense. His heart pounded in his chest. Then he heard it, a low groaning sound like something vast moving in the ice, something shifting. The weavers were near. They could sense warmth from miles away. "Move," Kaylin hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. They sprinted through the dark corridors, the crunch of their boots the only sound in the suffocating silence. But just as they turned the corner, the emergency lights flickered one last T. The emergency lights flickered back on, casting pale blue shadows across the ice-covered walls. Miles' breath fogged in his helmet as he tugged Kaylin forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel the cold seeping deeper into his bones, but the dread, the heavy, suffocating fear came not from the cold, but from the approaching figures. The weavers. There were 4 of them, their frozen bodies towering in the corridor ahead, cloaked in layers of frost and ice. They moved with unnatural grace, silent except for the sound of ice crunching underfoot, like giants walking through the remains of a long-dead world. Each step they took sent shivers through the ship, and the frost patterns on the walls seemed to ripple in time with their movements, as if the ship itself was alive, as if it was feeding off their presence. Kaylin's grip tightened on her utility cutter. The weapon, once just a tool to keep her alive, was now her lifeline. She held it with the cold, grim precision of someone who had learned the hard way to survive in a world where warmth was a currency. The weavers were the embodiment of that brutal law, survival through consumption, to take or be taken. "They'll never let us go," Kaylin whispered, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain composed. Her eyes flickered to the weavers and her body stiffened, her breath shallow. "We break their law and they'll kill us. They'll consume everything." Miles looked at her, seeing the weight of the past in her eyes. She had lived by this law for far too long, forced to trade her humanity for survival. But Miles wasn't going to let that happen, not on his watch. "We're not playing by their rules anymore," he said, his voice steady, despite the terror that was beginning to pulse in his own chest. "We'll fight. We'll make our own way out." He moved first, reaching for the plasma torch on his belt. He triggered it with a quick motion, and the blue flame hissed to life, cutting through the icy air. The ship groaned under their feet as the tension in the metal and ice built to a deafening crescendo. The weavers halted in their tracks, their glowing ice-blue eyes narrowing, studying them with an intensity that sent a chill running down Miles' spine. One of the weavers, the leader, stepped forward. Its face, once human, was now grotesque, a mask of frozen flesh, distorted and swollen by the cold. Its skin was cracked like porcelain, and its eyes were solid ice, devoid of any warmth or humanity. "You break the law," the weaver's voice rumbled, low and guttural. It sounded like the grinding of ice on stone, hollow and unfeeling. "You choose warmth, you choose death." Kaylin's eyes flicked to Miles. He could see the hesitation there, the flicker of doubt. She knew what these creatures were capable of. She had seen it all before, and yet something in her was different now. Something had changed when she'd chosen to trust him. "We don't have to do this," Miles said, his hand still tight around the plasma torch. "We can choose another way." The leader weaver tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion. "Another way?" It echoed, its voice thick with disbelief. "You speak of compassion, the weak are fuel, they always were. You will die like the others, consumed by the cold." Miles' grip tightened on his weapon. He had no intention of dying here, not today, not like this. Not if I can help it. Kaylin stepped forward, the cutter still clenched in her hands. Her face was pale, her lips blue, but her eyes burned with something new. A fire that had been rekindled by the warmth she had felt from Miles. A warmth she had given without expecting anything in return. The Weaver leader's ice-filled gaze flicked to her, then back to Miles. "You would challenge the law of survival. You would sacrifice yourselves for a lie." The ground beneath them trembled again, the ship groaning as if it was alive, protesting the confrontation. Kaylin raised the cutter, its fuel cell still dead, but the mechanism still worked, barely. She looked at the leader of the Weavers and spoke, her voice steady, though every word carried the weight of her choices. "The law of survival is broken," she said. "It's not about taking, it's about giving. It's about choosing warmth even when it's easier to take what you need. You gave up your humanity when you chose the cold. I refuse to do that. I refuse to become you." The leader's expression twisted in anger. "Then you are weak, a child playing with fire, you will burn." Suddenly the ship's lights dimmed, the emergency systems flickering on and off. Miles, suit alarmed, signaling a power drain. He glanced at his power reserves, already at 40%. They didn't have long before their suits failed completely, leaving them vulnerable to the cold. "Run," Miles shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. Kaylin didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the nearest bulkhead, her boots crunching on the frozen floor. Miles followed close behind, the Weavers, low growls echoing in the ship's hollow corridors. He didn't know how long they could outrun them, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going down without a fight. The Weavers surged after them, their movements swift and predatory. They weren't just hunting for them, they were hunting for warmth, for anything that could feed their endless hunger. As Miles and Kaylin rounded a corner, they found themselves face to face with a sealed door, the only way forward. Kaylin grabbed the emergency override panel, her gloved fingers fumbling with the frozen system. "It's locked," she hissed. "We're trapped." Before Miles could respond, the ship trembled again, this time with a deafening force. The Weavers had caught up. Cliffhanger. The heavy footsteps of the Weavers echoed in the corridor, closing in. Kaylin's hand trembled as she slammed it against the control panel, trying to override the door's lock. The sound of scraping metal grew louder, closer, as the Weavers' footsteps neared. "Move," Miles shouted, but the door refused to open. A deep, primal roar filled the hallway. The Weavers were almost upon them. Miles turned to Kaylin, his pulse racing. "We fight. We make our stand here." The ice-coated walls trembled once more as the Weavers closed in from both sides. There was no time left me, and then everything went dark. The Weavers' footsteps were so close now, the scraping of their frost-ridden boots like the grinding of ancient glaciers, slow and deliberate. The heavy breath of their frozen bodies filled the hallway, suffocating the air with the chill of inevitability. Kaylin's hand was still on the frozen override panel, her fingers shaking with desperation. The door remained stubbornly shut. The Weavers had them trapped. "Please open," Kaylin hissed through clenched teeth, slamming her palm against the cold metal once more. Her voice was a whisper now, lost in the growing terror around them. "I can't." Miles gritted his teeth, his hand clutching the plasma torch. His suit's power reserves were rapidly depleting, and his body was growing colder with every passing second. The emergency alarms echoed in his ears as his suit systems began to struggle against the oppressive cold. The temperature in his helmet began to drop, and his fingers began to lose their dexterity. It was a fight against time now. "We can't just wait for them to come to us," Miles said, his voice low, steady despite the pounding in his chest. He looked down at the cutter in Kaylin's hands. The fuel cell was dead, but the tool itself, small, sharp, might still have value. Kaylin's hand clenched tighter around the cutter. "They'll kill us the moment they get close enough." She was right, of course. The Weavers didn't play by rules, only by consumption. Miles could feel the weight of their law pressing in on him, the crushing inevitability of it. The law of survival, of taking warmth from others until there was nothing left to take. But even with that weight pressing against him, Miles refused to believe that this was the only way. "There has to be another way," he muttered, more to himself than to Kalen. He turned, looking at the walls, the control panel, the bulkhead. There had to be something they could use. Then a thought sparked in his mind. The ship wasn't just cold, it was alive with power systems, with the hum of failing machinery, with the tremors of pressure and ice shifting. The ship was more than a tomb. It was a weapon in its own right. He lunged for the manual override panel next to the door. "Kalen, help me." She turned, her eyes wide. "What are you doing?" "Buying us some time," he said, prying open the panel with his bare hands, pulling back a piece of rusted metal. He had no idea what he was looking for, but his instincts kicked in. In his years of salvage work, he'd learned to improvise, to make do with what was available. And right now, what was available was a malfunctioning system in a derelict ship with no power. Frost burned at his fingers as he connected wires, rerouting power, manipulating the controls with a speed that surprised even him. Sweat beaded on his forehead as his suit fought the cold, his breath coming faster now. "You're wasting time," Kalen snapped, her voice a sharp crack in the tense silence. "I'm not," he said through clenched teeth. "I'm triggering a burst of power to break the locks. It'll only last for a few seconds. We run or we're dead." The ship groaned, a deep, metallic sound that rattled the walls, and then with a sharp hiss, the door opened. Miles didn't wait to see if it would hold. He pulled Kalen into the narrow passageway, his heart pounding. The weavers were close now. He could hear their breath low and steady as they advanced. The ice on the walls began to crack, creaking with every movement the weavers made. They were relentless, but Miles couldn't afford to stop. "We're almost there," he said, his voice tight, urging Kalen to move faster. They raced down the dark, narrow passage, the flickering lights casting an eerie, fractured glow over the ship's ancient corridors. The walls closed in on them, the ship's structure warping as if the ice was attempting to swallow them whole. They reached a larger open area, a cargo hold. Miles pushed through, glancing around, searching for the ship's main systems. He saw the emergency control panel at the far end, where the ship's primary power source was located. "We need to cut through to the reactor," Miles said, pointing toward the panel. "If we can access the core, we can trigger a distress signal or create an emergency system failure that'll give us a chance to escape." Kalen looked at the door, then at Miles. "You're crazy," she said, her voice shaking. He shook his head. "I'm not. We're not just running. We're taking control. We're breaking the law." Before Kalen could respond, the weavers' growls echoed from the hallway behind them. They had found them. The floor beneath them rumbled as the weavers began to advance, their heavy footsteps deafening in the silence of the ship. Miles grabbed Kalen's arm, pulling her toward the emergency panel. His hands were frozen stiff, but he ignored it, yanking the wires free, hopping to find the connection he needed. "Do it," Kalen hissed, the urgency in her voice matching his own panic. Miles slammed his hand down on the panel, triggering a pulse of energy that surged through the ship, illuminating the control systems. The lights flickered, casting chaotic shadows in the cargo hold. The weavers roared. Miles spun around. They were close, too close. The leader weaver, its grotesque face frozen in a twisted grin, stepped forward. Its eyes, ice-cold and soulless, locked onto him. "You think you can escape?" the weaver growled. "The cold is the law, you cannot defy it." Miles' suit alarm began to flash warnings. He had less than 10% power remaining. The weavers were nearly upon them. "Cliffhanger." Just as the weaver reached out to grab him, a bright light blazed from the ship's reactor core. A pulse of heat flooded the cargo hold. The weavers recoiled, the light burning them like ice melting in the sun. The temperature in the ship spiked, causing the ice to crack and shatter across the walls. "Run," Miles shouted. But it was too late. As they turned to escape, the weavers surged forward, their massive forms moving faster than Miles could react. The lights flickered one final time before they went out completely, leaving them in complete darkness. Their only hope now, survival in the void. The hallway exploded in chaos as the mercenaries poured in. Michael and Kyle were pinned behind the wall, the sounds of blaster fire deafening in the narrow corridor. The reactor was just beyond them, the heart of the station. They couldn't let the mercenaries get to it. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. Kyle moved first, darting out from cover with fluid grace, her alien weapon raised. She fired, a sharp, searing shot that took down one of the mercenaries, his body crumpling to the ground with a heavy thud. Michael followed her lead, his own rifle aimed and steady as he returned fire, his shots finding their marks. The mercenaries didn't retreat. Instead, they pressed forward, their own weapons flashing in the dim light. There were too many of them, but Michael didn't care. Not anymore. The weight of his previous choices, the sacrifice, the fire on Deck 7, it all felt irrelevant now. This was the moment that would define everything. "Move," Kyle shouted, her voice filled with urgency as she ducked low, using the corner for cover. She was a blur of motion, her every step calculated, a dancer in a deadly game. Michael followed her, staying close but not as fast. His head was still reeling from the pressure, from the choices, from the knowledge that whatever happened next, the station, Selena 9, would never be the same again. They made it to the reactor room's entrance, but the mercenaries were hot on their heels, too many to fight off. Michael glanced at Kyle, seeing the determination in her gold eyes, the same fierce resolve that had kept her alive this long. "We have to shut it down," he said, voice hoarse. Kyle nodded, her focus never wavering. "I'll do it, you cover me." She moved toward the reactor controls, quickly working to bypass the security protocols. Michael kept his weapon raised, watching for any sign of movement. The countdown to catastrophe was nearing its final minutes. The mercenaries could destroy everything with just one wrong move. A shot rang out and Michael jerked back as it grazed his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, his body instinctively tensing as the pain surged through him. He barely noticed the blood staining his sleeve. There was no time for that now. He returned fire, the weapon steady in his hands. But the mercenaries weren't the only problem. The countdown had sped up. The reactor's systems were glitching. The control panel in front of Kyle started to spark, smoke billowing from the exposed wiring. Kyle's face twisted with frustration, and she slammed her fist down on the console. "It's not working," she muttered, frantic. "I need more time, Michael, I need." Before she could finish, a large explosion rocked the station, the blast sending a shockwave through the room. Michael's body was thrown against the wall, the air knocked out of him. He gasped, trying to regain his footing as the lights flickered, the station's systems failing one by one. Kyle was already back on her feet, her expression cold but determined. She sprinted to the console, dodging another round of fire from the mercenaries. Her hands flew over the panel, reconfiguring circuits with deft precision. Michael watched her work, his mind racing. He knew they didn't have much time. "We're not going to make it," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky with adrenaline. "We have to stop them." But then a new sound echoed through the room, the unmistakable sound of reinforcements. It was too late to escape, too late to save the station without making a stand. The door behind them slammed open, and two more mercenaries charged in. Michael swung around, firing at them instinctively. One went down with a grunt, but the second kept moving forward, his rifle aimed at Kyle. "No," Michael shouted, sprinting toward her. The mercenary's gun flashed, and time seemed to slow. The shot rang out, and Michael heard Kyle cry out. He was too late. A moment of choice. Kyle crumpled to the ground, clutching her side as blood poured through her fingers. Michael's heart clenched. The reactor, the station, it didn't matter anymore. She mattered. "No," Michael gasped, rushing to her side. "Kyle, stay with me, stay with me." She blinked up at him, her breathing shallow, her body racked with pain. The golden light in her eyes was dimming, but there was still that fierce determination in them. Her blood stained his hands as he tried to stop the bleeding. "It's too late for me," she whispered, a pained smile curling on her lips. "You have to finish this." "I won't leave you," Michael yelled, the words breaking as panic surged in his chest. She shook her head weakly. "You already did, we both did, but the station, Michael. Selena 9, this is your fight now, you have to finish it, you have to survive." Kyle's breath hitched, her eyes flickering. The mercenaries were closing in, but there was no way Michael could leave her side. Then Kyle's hand reached for the reactor control panel, her fingers trembling as she pressed a final button. The screen flickered. Michael could see the countdown. It had stopped. The reactor's core was stabilizing. The aftermath. Silence filled the room. The mercenaries had been dealt with, either dead or in retreat, their will broken. But it wasn't victory that Michael felt. He only felt a terrible ache in his chest as he cradled Kyle's body in his arms, the weight of the world pressing down on him. She was alive, but barely. Michael knew there was nothing more he could do. Voss arrived moments later, flanked by a few medics, but it was already too late. They couldn't save her. The station had been spared, but the cost had been high. The pain was unbearable. Is she? Voss trailed off, looking at Kyle. There was no need to finish the question. The answer was clear. She saved us, Michael whispered, staring down at her. Kyle's golden eyes flickered open one last time. Her voice was barely audible, but Michael heard it. Selena 9 will rise, she said, her words fragile but full of purpose. You will rise. Michael nodded, his heart shattering as he whispered, I'll make sure of it. The lights flickered once more before plunging the cargo hold into darkness. Miles could hear Kalen's labored breathing, steady but panicked, as they stood there in the cold, unrelenting blackness. The hum of the reactor core, still pulsing with its last burst of energy, seemed to vibrate through the walls, filling the ship with a low, ominous hum. The Weavers were close. He could feel them, the air shifting with their presence as if they were a storm closing in. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee to the nearest escape pod and abandon the Derelict to its fate. But Kalen's words echoed in his mind. We are not playing by their rules anymore. His suit's power reserves were dangerously low. He could feel the cold creeping in around his limbs, the pressure building in his chest. They didn't have much time. We need to go, Miles said, his voice tight, barely audible over the sound of their approaching pursuers. He could feel Kalen's hand on his arm, her fingers cold and unresponsive as they both leaned into the pulse of the reactor's last burst of heat. The escape pods are in the rear section. No, Kalen interrupted, her voice a rasp as she looked at him with those wide black eyes. We can't run, we don't survive by running. Miles turned, trying to catch her gaze in the gloom. He could barely see her face through the frost on his helmet's visor, but he could feel her fear, strong, sharp, raw. It matched his own. We can survive, he said. We just need to get to the pods and call for backup. The beacon worked, help is coming. Kalen shook her head, the motion barely visible in the dim light. If we run, they'll catch us, they always do. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And then we become them. Miles froze, understanding flashing in his mind like a sudden explosion. The Weavers weren't just predators. They were survivors who had become monsters, choosing to feed off others in the name of self-preservation. They had surrendered to the cold, letting it break them down into something less than human. Their minds and hearts had frozen as surely as their bodies. And Kalen, she had chosen warmth. She had chosen to fight for something better than survival at any cost. I won't let that happen to you, Miles said, his voice low and filled with resolve. I won't let you become like them. Kalen didn't speak for a moment, and when she did, her words were measured, as if she were weighing each one with care. You don't get it, do you? That's the law, the only law. The weak feed the strong, and the strong take what they need. It's what keeps us alive. It's what kept me alive. Miles reached out, grabbing her arm gently. Not anymore, he said firmly. Not if we can help it. He took a deep breath, forcing his thoughts to clear. The Weavers were almost here, and they were more than capable of tearing through them both. But there was one thing they had, something the Weavers didn't choice, and with that there was still hope. Listen to me, he said. If we want to survive this, we need to turn the tables, we need to fight back. Kalen's eyes flickered with doubt. How? She asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Miles didn't answer right away. He was scanning the room, his mind racing. They were in a cargo hold, surrounded by remnants of supplies and old technology, stuff left over from the ship's last mission. Among the wreckage, he spotted something, a storage container that had been torn open during the earlier chaos. Inside, it was a set of old supply crates, some abandoned tools, and at the very back, something that caught his eye, a fuel cell. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Kalen saw where his gaze was focused. You think that'll help? If we can rig it to one of the reactor cores, it'll give us enough energy to disable the Weaver's tracking systems, just long enough to get away. She stared at him, but the ship will implode. It doesn't matter, Miles shook his head. If we don't do this, we'll be dead anyway. I'll take the risk. She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face, reading him in a way he wasn't entirely comfortable with. But then, without another word, she nodded. Then let's do it. They moved quickly, almost mechanically, grabbing the fuel cell and working to rig it to the reactor's emergency systems. Miles was the technician, and he worked with practiced precision, bypassing the damaged circuits and rerouting power through the fuel cell. Kaylin stayed close, watching for any sign of the weavers, her cutter still clutched in her hands. The hum of the reactor was growing louder, the energy pulsing through the walls as Miles worked. He could feel the cold creeping in, his body growing stiffer with each passing second, but he pushed through it, focusing on the task at hand. There was no time to waste. "Almost there," Miles muttered, his fingers trembling as he connected the final wire. Kaylin glanced toward the door. The weavers were coming, their growls growing louder with every passing moment. Then, as if to punctuate the rising tension, the ship shook violently. Something had hit it. The walls groaned as the ship's superstructure shifted, and the reactor core pulsed in response, sending a wave of heat through the chamber. "Now," Miles shouted, slamming the final switch. The energy surged, and a loud crack rang through the room as the fuel cell ignited, sending a burst of power through the ship's systems. The lights flickered, then shut off completely, leaving them in complete darkness once again. The weavers stopped at the sound of the power failure. They hesitated, confused, their eerie whispers echoing in the dark. But it was the last hesitation they would get. Miles grabbed Kaylin's arm, pulling her toward the emergency hatch. The blast had worked. They had bought themselves precious seconds, enough time to make a run for it. The door behind them slammed shut with a deafening crash as Miles and Kaylin sprinted through the narrow corridor. The ship was groaning under pressure, its structure warping with the force of the energy surge they had just triggered. Miles could feel the cold gnawing at his limbs, his suit's power reserves dropping rapidly as the temperature continued to fall. His breath fogged up his helmet, and every step felt heavier, the weight of the weaver's pursuit driving him forward. Kaylin was beside him, her breathing shallow, her grip on the cutter tight. Her eyes were wide, scanning every shadow, every dark corner as if the weavers could appear at any moment. They had gained ground already, and every second counted. "We don't have much time," Kaylin hissed, glancing back over her shoulder. "They're adapting, they'll find us." Miles didn't respond, his focus entirely on the flickering corridor ahead. They needed to make it to the reactor core, to the heart of the ship, where he could hopefully trigger a failsafe, anything that would disrupt the weaver's pursuit. "Just a little further," Miles said, his voice tight with effort. "The reactor's down this way, we can still fight them off, we just need to get to it." But even as he spoke, the ship trembled beneath them, and the walls cracked with the pressure of the weaver's pursuit. The sound of their growls was getting closer, more frantic, and Miles could feel it in his bones. They weren't just chasing them. They were hunting them. He slammed his fist against the control panel next to the door, triggering the emergency override. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing the next section of the ship, an old maintenance corridor lined with ancient power conduits and rusted pipes. The dim emergency lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the walls. Kaylin didn't hesitate. She sprinted ahead, her boots crunching on the frozen floor as they pushed forward into the darkened maintenance area. "We'll never make it through the next section," she said, her voice strained. "They'll trap us in the engine room, we're cornered." Miles didn't look back, but he could hear the rising panic in her voice. She had seen it happen too many times. The weavers were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to consume the warmth of anything that lived. But Miles wasn't about to let that happen. Not to Kaylin, not to himself. "Trust me," he said, his words firm despite the growing fear. "We're not running anymore. This is where we make our stand." They rounded another corner, and ahead of them, through the jagged corridor, Miles saw it, the reactor control room. The entrance was sealed, but it was their last chance. Miles reached for the override again, his gloved hand fumbling with the controls. Come on," he muttered, swiping the panel. The door clicked open with a loud snap. The moment the door opened, the temperature inside the reactor room hit them like a wall. The hum of the reactor core, still alive with power, reverberated through the walls. Miles could feel the warmth seeping through the thick layers of ice on his suit, but he knew it wouldn't last. They needed to act quickly. Kaylin darted inside, her eyes scanning the room, but Miles' attention was focused on the flickering panels before them. The reactor's energy reserves were still strong enough to power the ship's core systems, but the weavers were closing in fast. They couldn't rely on the ship's systems anymore. "They're coming," Kaylin whispered. "We have seconds before they..." Miles grabbed her arm, his voice urgent. "Start the manual override. We can send a distress signal. I'll hold them off." Kaylin shook her head, but she didn't argue. She moved to the nearest terminal, her fingers trembling as she tapped the keys, her breath quickening. She didn't have the luxury of fear anymore. She had learned the hard way to focus on the task at hand. The door to the reactor room slammed shut behind them, but Miles could hear the growling and scraping of the weavers outside. Their presence was like a living thing, an oppressive force that made every breath feel heavier. "They'll breach the door in seconds," Kaylin said, glancing over her shoulder at Miles. "You won't be able to stop them." "I don't need to stop them," Miles said through gritted teeth. "Just slow them down." He pulled out the plasma torch, his hand trembling as he activated it. The blue flame sputtered to life, casting an eerie glow over the reactor's metallic surface. He aimed the torch at the emergency conduit beside the door, cutting a hole through the thick plating. The air in the room hissed as the metal fused, and a cloud of steam billowed from the exposed wound in the door. The weavers were already here. The growls grew louder. One of them slammed against the door, its massive, ice-covered hand leaving a trail of frost as it pressed against the metal. Miles didn't look back. His entire focus was on the plasma torch, cutting through the last layer of the door's protective plating. He needed to get it open just long enough for Kaylin to complete the override. They had to send the signal. Click, the door's lock released, and the panel in front of him flashed green. "Done," Kaylin shouted, her voice tinged with relief. "We have a signal." Miles exhaled in relief, but before he could turn to her, the door slammed open with a deafening crash. The weavers burst through. They were massive, towering figures, their frozen bodies covered in layers of frost that glistened like armor. Their eyes were glowing with the cold, their breaths heavy and ragged, as if they had been waiting for this moment. They moved with unnatural speed, their limbs long and spindly, their jaws hanging open in hunger. The leader weaver stepped forward, its grotesque face twisted in an expression that could only be described as rage. Its eyes locked onto Miles, its mouth parting with a guttural growl. "You should have joined us," it said, its voice like the grinding of ice. "Now you will be consumed." Miles didn't hesitate. He shoved Kaylin toward the console, signaling her to keep moving. His hands moved with practiced speed as he raised the plasma torch, stepping in front of her to shield her from the oncoming weavers. "You want to consume?" Miles shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "Then take it." He triggered the emergency override once more, this time rerouting all of the reactor's remaining power into the emergency containment systems. A surge of heat flooded the room, and the weavers recoiled, their frozen bodies screeching as the warmth burned them. The weavers were not immune to the ship's internal heat, and for a split second they faltered. The blackness of the reactor room swallowed them whole as the emergency lights flickered and died. Miles' head hit the cold metal floor with a thud, his suit's thermal systems sputtering under the strain of the collapsing power reserves. He could barely feel his limbs, the cold creeping deeper into his bones as his breath fogged up his helmet. His pulse was pounding in his ears, and every second felt like it could be his last. But Kaylin was still moving. He didn't know how, but through the haze of frozen panic, he could see her silhouette, her figure darting into the darkness ahead, her voice calling back to him through the fog of his fatting consciousness. "We need to go," she shouted, her words frantic. She grabbed his arm, pulling him up, her grip like iron despite the cold. "Now, Miles." He tried to move, tried to stand, but his body refused to cooperate. The cold was too much, his suit was failing. The reactor's heat had been their only hope, and now that it was gone, so was the warmth they needed to survive. The weavers were closing in. He could hear their growls, the scrape of their frozen feet on the metal floor, getting louder with every passing second. Kaylin's hand was on his shoulder, urging him forward. Her voice was filled with urgency. "We can't stay here, Miles. We need to get to the escape pod." The words cut through the fog in his mind. Escape pod. He blinked, trying to clear the dizziness from his vision. He had no idea how much time they had, but they couldn't afford to waste another second. With every moment that passed, the weavers were getting closer. Kaylin didn't give him the time to question himself. She dragged him toward the far side of the reactor room, where the emergency escape hatch was located. Miles' body screamed in protest, every movement feeling like an eternity, but somehow Kaylin kept pulling him forward, relentless. like she had become a force of nature herself. "We're almost there," she muttered, her voice breathless. She looked over her shoulder at him, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else in them too, something steely, determined. He didn't have the strength to say anything, but he forced himself to move, step by painful step, toward the hatch. Suddenly, the lights in the corridor flickered back on. Miles felt a surge of hope, only for it to die when he saw the weavers rounding the corner. The leader weaver was at the front, its ice-cold gaze locking onto Kalen and Miles. Its skin cracked as it moved, the ice covering its body glistening like a living statue of frost. Its eyes burned with an unholy hunger. "You can run," the weaver snarled, "but you cannot escape." Kalen didn't stop. She was pulling Miles faster now, her pace unrelenting, and Miles felt a surge of adrenaline that pushed him past the cold, past the exhaustion. They reached the hatch. Kalen didn't hesitate. She ripped open the emergency seal with a single motion, revealing the escape pod beyond. The narrow, cramped space was their last chance. "Go, go," Kalen shouted. Miles stumbled forward, his body moving on instinct as she shoved him inside the pod. He collapsed onto the seat, his head spinning, his chest heaving with every labored breath. Kalen followed, slamming the hatch shut behind them with a finality that made Miles' heart skip a beat. The pod's thrusters ignited with a deafening roar, sending them hurtling into the cold void of space. The ship's gravity gave way, and they were weightless, floating, suspended between life and death. For a moment, everything was still. And then, through the viewport, Miles saw the Derelict, the ship they had fought so hard to escape, fatting into the distance. The weavers were left behind, trapped in the frozen void with nothing but their law to sustain them. "We did it," Miles said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Kalen didn't answer right away. She was staring out the viewport, her face a mask of exhaustion and quiet resolve. Her fingers were trembling, but not from fear, from the cold. Miles reached for the heating module at his belt and activated it, handing it to her without a word. She accepted it gratefully, her hands shaking as she held it close to her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." He nodded, too tired to say anything more. They both needed rest, needed warmth, but for the first time in days, they were safe. The escape pod continued its journey into the unknown, drifting further from the wreckage of the Derelict. They had survived against all odds. But there was more to their survival than just escaping the weavers. The cold had been their enemy, but it had also taught them something. Kalen had chosen warmth when she could have chosen survival by any other means. She had chosen humanity, even when it seemed like the world was telling her to abandon it. And Miles, in turn, had chosen to help her, despite the cost to himself. They had chosen each other. As the pod systems kicked in, stabilizing their flight path, the lights dimmed to a soft glow, and the hum of the engines became a steady backdrop to their quiet thoughts. Kalen leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing, her body beginning to relax for the first time in days. Miles did the same, his mind drifting, the weight of the past few days pressing against his consciousness. But in the darkness of the pod, he allowed himself a moment of peace, a moment of hope. Several hours later, the rescue team's signal pinged through the pod's communication system. A burst of static followed by a voice that sent a wave of relief through Miles' body. "This is the Ranger responding to your distress beacon. We've located your position. Hang tight. Help is on the way." Miles felt his heart rate slow, the tension in his body unwinding. They weren't alone anymore. Kalen opened her eyes, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "We survived," she whispered. "Together," Miles replied. Cliffhanger. But as they continued their journey toward the rescue ship, the vast emptiness of space stretched out before them. The wreckage of the Derelict was far behind, but the cold still lingered in the void, waiting. They had survived the weavers, but in the depths of space, survival was never guaranteed. They both knew, without saying a word, that the real battle for warmth, the battle for humanity's survival, was just beginning.